Hello and welcome. My name's Judd Hendricks, and this is our Friday afternoon Interfaith Paths to Peace Enneagram Community of Practice. Each week this fall, we are looking at a different Enneagram number and doing a deep dive to learn more about those numbers and how we can love and appreciate and be in relationship with these specific numbers. Today, we're looking at the Enneagram 5, called the Investigator or the Observer. And welcome to that journey. The purpose of looking at the Enneagram is to understand the reason why different people show up in the world and behave in the world in ways in which they do. And so I've got a Prezi that I'm going to use and invite us to use to guide us through our time together. Thanks for being here. And again, one of the reasons why we do Enneagram work is because to create peace between people, we need to know each other. And to have our own inner harmony peace, we need to understand why we do the things we do, why we perceive the world the way we do. And so this work allows us to do that with the Enneagram. So give me a second here. I'm going to pull up our screen and we'll get started. What I hope to do during our time together is to give you a basic understanding of the Enneagram personality typologies, but also then to do a deep dive into looking at the Enneagram number 5. The Enneagram is made up of 9 different points, 9 different personality types, and each of these types is describing essentially caricatures or personality traits that we have. The Enneagram tries to look at both what it is that we may have come into the world with, maybe our archetypical DNA that influences the kinds of personalities that we have, but also is interested in early childhood environment. The idea that personality is shaped as we're children trying to thrive and survive in our early childhood environments. And therefore, in doing that, we take on certain capacities of perception. We become aware of certain things and we develop those awarenesses because we think they will help us thrive and survive. What we're aware of in the room, the feelings that are emerged, we become highly sensitized towards certain things in our environment. And then those forms of awareness are translated into behaviors. We react to those and we develop patterns of perception and behavior. And that's essentially what personality types are. So these are patterned. You could even say that we have an Enneagram brain, that there's a 5 brain, so to speak, that we have patterns of neurological firing that sometimes we lose control over. Those just become natural firing. So there's a stimulus, something we're aware of in the environment, and then we have a response to it out of that pattern behavior. What we're going to be looking at are what are some of those pattern behaviors that each of the Enneagram numbers, specifically the 5, manifest. And then we're going to be asking, how can these numbers be more healthy? So the idea with the Enneagram is that you don't necessarily change your core identification. You're always that number. But there is movement in levels of health. And then there's also different ways in which we manifest those related to what's called our wing type, which is a number related to yours, which with the 5 would be the 6 and the 4. But also where we go or what characteristics we take on based upon being stressed or being in non-stress or integrative spaces. And we take on different characteristics of those numbers as well. And we'll look at that with the 5. Ultimately, the hope is that we can be healthy, whatever our number is, that we can be more free, more available, more open, and have more choices about behavior that would fit the situation or the environment more appropriately. And that's kind of what we consider a neuroses, is when you're so locked down into your forms of perception and behavior, patterns of behavior, that you don't have freedom. to choose to do something other than that. And that's where we begin to see destructive tendencies, difficult relationships that move into psychopathology. The idea is that we can be more free, more open, more aware of our tendencies, and therefore have more freedoms of response. And that when certain situations, we can realize that we may not be perceiving things or perceiving everything based upon these patterns of perception, so that we can loosen those and be attentive to things that we may not normally be aware of in order to be more healthy people. So that's the idea behind the Enneagram, and specifically we'll be looking at the 5 today. We are moving. We've been spending the last several weeks looking at the 2, the 3, and the 4. So this is the Heart Triad, and the Enneagram is made up of 3 triads: the Heart Triad, 2, 3, 4; the Head Triad, which is what we're moving into today, which is the 5, 6, and the 7, and then the Gut or the Instinctual Triad, which is the top 8, 9, and 1. So today we're going to be moving into the Head Triad. So all the 5, 6, and 7 share some similar things in common because they have a fixation in the head, or what we call the doing triad. And they're all working in different ways with fear. They manifest fear in different ways, but they're often working, again, with their head and then thinking. They're mostly all thinking types. When we look at Myers-Briggs, and we can show that there is a little bit of difference in those based upon your wings. But they're also working with fear in different ways. And so briefly, we can see that the 5 that we'll be looking at today goes in with their fear, which means they're the most introverted, they're the most self-reflective with their anxiety. That's when their anxiety invites them to go inward. The 6s are the most ambiguous with their with their fear. And they tend to be some of the most anxious and fearful people. They go both in and out with their fear. 7s, which are the most extroverted, are also in the fear triad, but they go out with their fear as a way of dealing with anxiety and fear. They move outward. 5s move inward. 6s are the most ambiguous, or both go outward and inward with their fear. So that is the Head Triad. And so let's look at some of the more characteristics of a 5. I'll be looking at some different charts to help understand and explain those as we go. This chart gives us a couple of different things for each number. One is it looks at the levels, which is over here on the right. And that's what I was talking about, that we may look different and still be a 5, but some of that's based upon what level of health we are. And again, level is related to degrees of freedom, or how much you're aware of and free to respond, while also affirming the certain gifts and perceptions that you've developed. But you have freedom with those. So we'll look at levels. Down at the bottom is direction of integration and disintegration. And we'll look at those a little bit. We're up here in the top left is wings. Again, if you have a wing of a different type, that will nuance. You'll take on some of the characteristics of that number. That nuance is your number. And then we'll also look at instinctual variance and how that also shapes or nuances the number. And what I hope is to give you kind of a holistic picture of type 5s using these charts. So let's begin. Type 5s, here are some caricatures of them. Type 5s, one of the things is they're the most introverted of all the types on the Enneagram. And type 5s as children often experienced, or in their early childhood experience, if there was stress or anxiety in their family, their response to that began to isolate themselves. So they would move away from those stressful experiences, conflict, out of fear. They would retreat both inwardly, and they would retreat away from people. So they would go in. Often children that were fives spent a lot of time in their room, even as young children, and reading books. Or fives often talk about like reading books in the little tents they would make, or going into your closet and having this physical boundary around you and other people. But that going into their rooms or going into these spaces also was an interior movement, that they would go in often in the form of really complex thinking. Again, they are not feeling types traditionally. A five with a four wing may be more feeling type, but they are often caught in their minds. And so they spend a lot of time thinking alone or processing alone, as a way of removing themselves from stressful or conflictual experiences or environments. And so you can see how these patterns develop over time. And some of the healthier levels, we can see a pioneering visionary, right? So they go into their minds and they can think of imaginative futures. They do observe a lot. So if they are in groups, they're often quiet, and they're like a five at a party has their back up against a wall, and they're observing everything that happens. And they have a really keen sense of perception, unlike extroverts who are always kind of in the center, and maybe unaware of their environment. Fives are very aware of their environment. You can often see them looking at other people, analyzing other people. A lot of psychologists are fives, because they can perceive what's happening with other people, but they can also think about what's happening with other people. They're very interested in information. And that is another form of how they deal with their anxiety, is they collect information. One of the images I like of fives is that they live in igloos or castles of books and information. So they surround themselves with this information. And they look out onto the world through these little holes that they create in their castle, onto the world. But they feel safe and protected in these environments, and they feel safe and needed because of the information they have. So often fives are in information technologies, librarians, professors, people who hold a lot of information in their head and process that. And again, so some of their healthier levels, we can see that they're perceptive, observist, focused, and innovator. They do a lot of innovating. They like to tinker with mechanical things, and can get really into the nuance of something. Language is important for them, technical language, the ability to articulate clearly, and nuanced language can be important to them as well. As they begin moving down, though, we begin seeing some of the difficulties with their isolationism, and moving away from people and not engaging people in interpersonal relationships. And you can begin to see that they have not developed the skills of relating to other people as well. Asperger's, different forms of being on the spectrum, have some five tendencies. And you can begin to see that fives move so much into the head that they don't relate as well with people, or it takes them a lot of energy to relate as well with people. It's not that they can't, it's just that that's not really where they get their energy. And sometimes it also creates more anxiety for them to try to manage interpersonal relationships. And as you can see, if they begin disconnecting from their own feeling states, their emotional life, that their minds, while brilliant, can also keep them from knowing what they feel. Sometimes fives report that they think their feelings. so they can think about what sadness is rather than experiencing sadness. And sometimes their emotional language for their emotions is not cultivated as well. And as we know in interpersonal relationships, a lot of times emotional intelligence and emotion, sharing that with other people, is a form of social capital. So if they don't have that capacity, if they're not aware of their relationships, you can see that the repercussions of that could be more forms of alienation, and not being able to share their emotions with people that they care about. And sometimes people sense that they feel distant from fives because they don't have the emotional capital. And that's mainly because fives may not know what they're feeling. They may be able to think their feelings, but a lot of times that doesn't provide the kind of social capital that we want in close relationships. And that's one of the things that fives need to do. We'll talk some more about that in a moment. As you can see, as them moving down in these levels of health, the studious expert, intense conceptualizer, provocative cynic. You can see this in a lot of professors that really love that kind of intellectual talk. I'm a 7, but I have a 5. I go to a 5 when I'm healthy, and I can really love talking to 5s because their ability to articulate theoretical ideas is quite fascinating. If we can stay with them, they really are informative around kind of details and theoretical philosophical ideas. At the lower levels, you can see that their isolation becomes a problem. They become a nihilist. They can look down on other people because they don't think other people are smart or thinking through something, or they don't have as much information. And they get so separated from other sources of information, they can become nihilistic in their thinking. At the bottom levels, terrified, alien, and imploding schizoid. Schizophrenia is an aspect of fives. Also, fives can go very dark in their thinking. They can be nihilistic. I would imagine Nietzsche was probably a 5. But they can, and they live between the skeptic, right, which is a 6, and they live in the tragic romantic. So you can see where they live on the Enneagram. There are 2 wings, like a 4, the tragic romantic, can also do that deep melancholy. So they can really like that kind of dark thinking. And if they're a 6, they can have a skeptic, so that they can be very skeptical as well, and critical in their thinking. And again, sometimes that's a form of intellectual curiosity, and that they actually know things in order to be critical of other things. And sometimes it's a form of moving away from fear, or intellectualizing their emotions, which they feel like they have less control over and understand. So a 5 moving towards integration moves towards an 8. And this is a really interesting move. 8s are more extroverted. And 5s can be really leaders, right? So an 8 is a boss. They're actually, much more knowing where they're going. So 5s that have integrated and have good personal relationships can make really great leaders. A lot of times they're not the showy leaders that we know. They're not 3s, right, that have all these interpersonal skills, are highly extroverted. But they can be quiet, firm, and really intelligent leaders. And healthy 5s really, if we will allow them to not be the stereotypical leader that's leading with their ego, but can lead with their deep observations, with their visionary understandings. If you want to know what's going on in an organization, ask a 5, because they've been witnessing it, they've been observing it, and they can pretty much tell you what's happening. 5s also in organizations like to be seen as the experts. And so when they can provide expert information, they can have their niche of where they fit. They work really well in organizations if they can find those spaces. where they really are experts, and they can be leaders in the area where they are an expert. So that's a 5 going to an 8. A 5 going to a 7 is interesting because it's also extroverted. But what we see at 5s moving to behaviors that look like 7s is they've gotten so isolated that they begin to fear the loss of their relationships. And so they move outward like 7s do in building all of these relationships. And the extroversion here is not really a healthy space for them. It can look awkward or odd. And sometimes it comes from a grasping space that introverts feel because they don't feel connected to other people. And so they can get highly extroverted, which is not really where they want to be. They would rather be alone, but they feel like they need to do that because they've not tended to relationships, which can be true in the sense that they do need to do that. But sometimes that highly extroverted energy is not a good space for them. They feel ungrounded, whereas 7s do that kind of naturally. It doesn't feel natural or look natural for 5s to be doing it. So that's 5s moving towards their integrate or their disintegration towards 7s. Looking at 5 wings, and I'll go to a different slide here to do these next parts. This is some work on archetypes for the different numbers. And so we can look at their wings and look at these archetypes. This is also what's called the self-preservation subtype, the sexual subtype, and social subtypes. So when we look at the 5s, that's what these different kind of archetypes or caricatures are of these groups. So the black is the self-preserving type, and those are people that are more concerned with their physical safety and well-being. The sexual subtypes are more interested in interpersonal relationships, not necessarily sexual, but more interpersonal or one-on-one relationships. Social subtypes tend to be more concerned about their social location and social relationships. So you can see how those, and here are the 5s with a 6 wing and the 5s with a 4 wing. So this gives us a lot of information here in these types. The kind of center type is the reclusive thinker. And again, that's if they're a self-preservation type. A social, a one-on-one type is the private lover. Like to be private and express that in intimacy, usually not with a lot of people. And then the public observer is somebody who does like to be in the public, but they're kind of witnessing what's going on in the public. Some other characteristics is the detached puzzler, the undemonstrative lover. Again, some of the challenges with 5s knowing about their passion or their energy can be difficult in interpersonal relationship. The trend analyzer, you can see that as the social type. Here, the crusty eccentric, the quirky lover, and the iconoclastic commentator. Again, all kind of introvert types, but that's how they kind of manifest differently. The 5 with the 4 wing, again, can be more kind of creative. I found a lot of musicians down here in this area because a musical mind, in fact, I think a lot of musicians are 5s, probably with a 4 wing. 5s like music. My son is a 5, and he is a musician. He writes amazing music, and he has a mathematical musical brain that I don't understand. He understands music theory and all of that. And he goes in between, I think, a 6 and a 4 wing, but he likes that kind of creativity and knowing music theory, and great teacher. And a lot of times 5s are professors, and you can see the 4 and the 6 wing are also pieces that they manifest. So I want to look at Enneagram typologies. Again, there is an overlay of the Enneagram and Myers-Briggs. So these are the Myers-Briggs numbers. one of the things I want us to note with fives is they're all thinking types. So the T is the real challenge. They can be intuitive types, and they can be sensing types as well. And they can also be P's and J's, and they're all introverts. So fives in the Myers-Briggs typologies are introverted thinking types. Those are their two primary Enneagram numbers. Why this is important, we often talk about integration if we're going to be healthy. And in the second half of life, one of the ideas that Carl Jung often talks about is cultivating the inferior aspect of your personality in the second half of life in order to move to wholeness. And I think this is important for fives, that they cultivate two things. That they cultivate extroversion, that they do need to tend to their interpersonal and extroverted relationships, and work on extroversion, being out there, so to speak, in the world and relating to other people. But also their feeling aspect, the ability to cultivate an awareness of their emotional intelligence is important, both for their own health and for their relationships. So those are always some of the challenges that we invite fives into, tending to extroversion. Again, they naturally get energy from being alone, but that can become isolating at lower levels of health. And also their thinking, to cultivate their inferior aspect of feeling, also brings them a sense of wholeness. So here are some famous Enneagram fives, and these are really just fascinating people. Tim Burton, right, which you can see with the movies that he makes, Charles Darwin, David Lynch, and Sinead O'Connor. Again, I think a lot of musicians are probably fives, both because they have that type of thinking capacity, as well as if they have some creativity as well. So here's some kind of a final slide on the fives that we use to help fives. Again, we've looked at some of the basic personality elements. The Hornerian types, they are a withdrawal type. And so what we mean by that is, how do they get their needs met? And often they do that through withdrawing. Again, fives can be extroverted and can have great social relationships. What fives often report, though, if they're going to be in a social space, they like to know that it's got boundaries. They want to know, this is kind of ongoing idea of being at a party where they just kind of they don't really know when it's going to start or end, can be very anxious producing for fives. It's not that they don't like to go to parties or be social. It's just they like some boundaries around that, knowing when they can come and when they can leave. How long do they have to be there? Because again, that is a true introversion idea, is they get energy from being alone. So that kind of extroversion does take a lot of energy from them, especially in large kind of crowds or parties or things like that. The lost childhood message is, your needs are not a problem. So again, fives, that sense of children that their needs either became a problem, or the energy it took extroverted wise was overwhelming for them. So you can see they're retreating away from that. Unconscious childhood message is, it's not okay to be comfortable in the world. So you see that retreating. Avarice or hoarding can be a weakness or a challenge for them. Again, and what that looks like, I think, for fives is they like to be stingy with their time and sometimes stingy with their things. There is kind of this, I've got my things, and that doesn't mean they have a lot of them, but their material possessions are are some of the ways they get their needs met, and they keep those close to them. And they may like things as well, like to have things, and but they can be stingy, I think, with their time is the stinginess that they manifest. The basic fears of being overwhelmed, helpless, incompetent, and incapable. So you can see these deeper kind of undercurrents of feeling overwhelmed, not being competent at what they do, or living in the world, to be competent living in the world, to manage the complexities of that. Basic desires to be compatible and competent. Secondary fear that their perceptions are insufficient to give them correct orientation. So again, I think this comes from their overdevelopment, sometimes with their thinking capacity, that they may not trust, because our emotions often give us a different kind of information by which to move forward. And I think if fives don't cultivate that, they can have a fear that they don't really know what they need to know from their emotional or their intuitive life to be able to move forward successfully. To come over here and look at, like, how can we be with fives in healthy ways? Again, I think a lot of the issues or dynamics we have with fives is kind of their introversion, interpersonal relationship. Again, asking fives, letting fives know when we're going to get together or be in social situations. There is a start time and an end time, so that they don't get anxious about that. They can show up when they need to show up. Also, helping fives sit with and tend to their emotional life can be very difficult for them. And giving them some space to do that, and maybe helping them be able to articulate that. But that can be very risky and difficult for fives as well. So giving them some space with their emotional life, and kind of staying with them to help them articulate that or express that can be important, because sometimes that can be overwhelming for fives, but to give them a safe space to do that. Recognition. So their saving grace is I have awareness of my own distortions. So bringing awareness and doing, the kind of their psychological work there, of how they may be distorting reality, or sometimes a negative or nihilistic lens may not be giving them a correct or a helpful perception of what's happening. Healing attitude. Maybe I can trust people and let them know what I need. Maybe I can live happily in the world. Maybe my future will be okay. Again, because when they go inward, they can get very skeptical, doubtful, negative, critical, and that can lead deeper into their own isolations and fears. Recognition for growth, recognizing my physical presence, feelings, and needs. Sometimes they can get disassociated from those. Spiritual jump start, to notice when I'm over-interpreting my experience. And here they're like the fours, that they can over-interpret or over-trust kind of their rational understandings of their experience, and get caught up in that, rather than taking on or listening to other people to give guidance and help around that. Their introversion sometimes cuts them off from helpful sources of input around their experience or around what's happening. And so staying connected to those relationships is important. And we've looked at their direction of growth, to be able to act in the world, to move into the world, to have confidence of moving into the world, that they can navigate those complexities and the interpersonal relationships that happen in the world. Invitation to abundance, to observe myself and others without judgment or expectations. Again, they can quickly go into their thinking brain, into a critical judgmental brain. Sometimes ones and fives test alike, which is interesting, because it's that critical nature that they both have, and their analytical nature. So ones and fives sometimes test high because they share that in common. And remembering to be engaged with reality, contemplating the world's riches. Again, continuing to move out of their closets, out of their rooms, out of their studies, out of their spaces that they feel safe and creative in, which is true, but in actually engaging in the world and developing competencies for interpersonal relationship and being leaders. Again, they can be effective leaders moving forward. So that, my friends, is the Enneagram 5. And we want to give a shout out to all of the Enneagram 5s in our lives, and saying that we see you and we deeply appreciate you. And we are thankful for what you bring to the world and what you bring to our own lives. And yeah, so that's Enneagram 5s. Hope you'll come back and join us next week when we're going to look at the Enneagram 6s, which is the loyalist, the loyal skeptic, and see how they're related to 5s. If you are an Enneagram 6 and want to join us next week, we would love to have you on a panel where we can explore a little bit more about who 6s are and how we can be in healthy relationships with them. Thanks for joining us today, and hope you have a good week. And let's love all of our Enneagram numbers, especially our 5s. Peace.